Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point on AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Great to have you in the conversation today. Rob, maybe we can grab clip one, have that ready to go, and maybe clip two. Want to talk a little bit about Barack, the Lightbringer, and his trip to Germany, giving his speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate, and I'm looking for that story. I've got it in the stack. I printed it out and raced out the door, bringing that with me, and I've got to find that story because it's a pretty amazing story from a newspaper in London, the London Telegraph. Remember, often we have to go to the UK press to get the straight scoop on what is happening in America. It was a London newspaper that broke the story about NSA surveillance. Wasn't a mainstream media outlet in the United States. But anyway, it's becoming increasingly clear that President Obama's speech at the Brandenburg Gate in Germany was an absolute, abysmal, colossal failure. Now, here is Niall Gardner in the London Telegraph. This is one of the leading newspapers now in the UK. And here is the title of his column: Barack Obama bombs in Berlin. Now, the Telegraph leans left in its politics. So these are people that ideologically are inclined to befriend Barack Obama, to support him, to be enthused about him. They saw him as a light bringer back in 2008. They were part of the adoring throngs of 200,000 that were there when he gave his speech in 2008 with that godlike reverb in the sound system. And now he says yesterday he bombed. Barack Obama bombs in Berlin. A weak, underwhelming address from a floundering president. This is a left-wing media. This was a weak address. It was an underwhelming address. It was an address from a floundering president. Here's how the piece opens. When John F. Kennedy delivered his Ich bin ein Berliner, remember that's the one where he says, I am a jelly donut in German. Actually, I think he did say, I am somebody from Berlin. It depends how you understand the German there. But I personally prefer I am a jelly rolled donut, personally, as a translation. But anyway, John F. Kennedy delivered his Ich bin ein Berliner speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate, June 26, 1963. 450,000 people flocked to hear him. 50 years later, a far more subdued only crowd of 4,500. That means that the JFK speech was 100 times bigger. The audience for the JFK speech was 100 times bigger than the audience yesterday for Barack Obama. Some of the early estimates we had were 6,000. Now they revised that down to 4,500. There were twice as many people out for the Tea Party rally yesterday at the U.S. Capitol grounds. Twice as many people turned out for the Tea Party than turned out for the Lightbringer, Barack Obama. So he had 4,500. JFK, 1963, 450,000. I don't have a trained eye, but that's 100 times. If you get 10 times, that'd be 45,000. 100 times be 450,000. So his crowd, Obama's crowd, was 1% yesterday, the size of the crowd that JFK drew in 1963. As the National, Niall Gardner goes on, as the National Journal noted, he didn't come away with much, winning just a smattering of applause from a crowd that was 100th the size of JFK's and far smaller than the 200,000 boisterous Germans who had listened to his 2008 address as a presidential candidate. JFK had a clear message when he came to Berlin a half century ago. The free world must stand up to communist tyranny. 24 years later, President Ronald Reagan stood in the same spot, famously calling on the Soviets to tear down this wall. Reagan's speech was a display of strength and conviction by the leader of the free world. In stark contrast to that of his presidential predecessors, Barack Obama's message on Wednesday was pure mush. Another cliched citizens of the world polemic with little substance. This was a speech big on platitudes and hopeless idealism while containing much that was counterproductive for the world's superpower. Ultimately, it was little more than a laundry list of Obama's favorite liberal pet causes. So bombs, according to the London Telegraph, Barack Obama bombs in Berlin. Now, the mainstream media in America is still out there trying to hack and flack for President Obama, the Lightbringer. We played you the soundbite yesterday from Chris Matthews. Oh, it was the sun. Sun was in his eyes. He couldn't read his speech because the sun obscured the teleprompter. It was the sun's fault. Couldn't blame it on Bush, so let's blame it on God. It was the sun's fault. Now, here is Chuck Todd, clip one. And the significant thing here is everybody's recognizing that this was an absolutely abysmal performance. He said here in the United States of America at one point. In another setting, he kept calling a diplomat by the wrong name. He mixed up the George Osborne, who is a chancellor in the UK, with a soul star, an R&B star, by the name of Jeffrey Osborne. So the guy's name, the diplomat's name, is only a chancellor of the UK. His name is George Osborne. And Barack Obama kept calling him Jeffrey after the R&B guy, the kind of stuff that if Rick Perry does it, that's all you hear about for weeks on end. But here's Chuck Todd trying to cover for Barack Obama. Let's listen.
There was an attempt to shrink the crowd size. Now, the White House was all too comfortable with allowing that to happen because they feared they could never live up to the billing of what happened 5 years ago, that they could never recreate another 250,000 people showing up. Maybe they would have gotten 25, 30, 40,000 people. Now, what I noticed in following this president for as long as I have, and you probably know exactly what I mean, is President Obama feeds off a crowd very well. The way this was all put together, you have this incredible setting, this incredible backdrop, and then you had that very distracting glass, and you could just see that the president himself wasn't feeding off of the crowd. And part of it was hot. Those folks were out there for 2.5 hours. Trust me, I was along there with them. And so it can sap your energy a little.
And I just wonder if that added a little bit to this. He finished that statement. So, gosh. So Chuck Todd making every excuse in the book for Barack Obama. He says it was lackluster, distracting glass. The president wasn't feeding off the crowd. It was hot. Folks were out there for 2.5 hours. All this can sap your energy. So all of which is to say this was a abysmal performance on the part of the president. Now, clip two, Rob. Let's play clip two. President Obama said quite famously when he was interviewed by Charlie Rose, look, I am not Dick Cheney. He didn't say those exact words, but he said, look, I've been compared to Dick Cheney, and I'm not. I'm not Dick Cheney. I'm completely different to Dick Cheney. And Liz Cheney, this is Dick Cheney's daughter, she actually agrees with Barack Obama that he is no Dick Cheney. Let's listen.
I do have to say, though, to give the president some credit, he continues to feel the need to proclaim that he's not Dick Cheney. And, every time I hear him say that, I got to say, you're right. Absolutely. This president is nowhere near the man or the leader that Dick Cheney is. And for him to sort of, have all of this rhetoric about honesty and about justice and about transparency, when we see what's going on here in the United States, across the board, his lack of credibility in dealing with the American people, I think he's left a lot of people, frankly, just chuckling around the globe, wondering what's going to come next here. So
Liz Cheney saying, when President Obama says he's not Dick Cheney, he is exactly right. He is not half the man that Dick Cheney is. Number to call if you want to join our conversation, 888-589-8840, 888-589-8840. Let's squeeze clip number 3 in if we can, Rob. This is Phil Gingrey from Georgia. We've been talking about gender roles. That's been front and center. We had all of the dust in the air over the finding by the Pew Research Center that 40% of households with children now are headed by moms as the primary breadwinner. And so it brought this whole question of gender roles into play. What's the role of a wife and a mother? what is the role of a husband and a father? And I've suggested to you what I think the clear indication in the scripture is, that God has designed women uniquely to be nurturers and to be workers at home, as Titus said. They work. I mean, Debbie worked much harder than I did when we had young kids. I'll guarantee you she worked harder than I did. She was up at the same time I was, if not earlier. She went to bed after I did or as late as I did, and she was working the whole time. I mean, it used to aggravate her no end when people would say, do you work or are you a homemaker? Well, she was a homemaker and she worked. It's not either or, it's both and. And that's what Paul instructs the older women to do in Titus 2, is teach the younger women how to be workers at home. So yes, women work. They work just as hard as men do. Their role, if you want, not that I would want to make this kind of evaluation, but if you had to evaluate which role is more important, going out there and making widgets for 10 hours or training the next generation of American citizens, I'm going to put my money on the training the next generation of American citizens. So you can't devalue the work. You know, remember G.K. Chesterton said, look, the problem with a woman working outside the home is it's limiting. You know, she's good at doing one thing. She's one thing to everybody. But if you're a mom raising kids, you are everything to those kids. Here's Phil Gingrey, clip 3, saying we need to do this in our public schools.
That, you know, maybe part of the problem is we need to go back into the schools at a very early age, maybe at the grade school level, and have a class for the young girls, and have a class for the young boys, and say, you know, this is what's important. You know, this is what a father does that is maybe a little different, maybe a little bit better than the talents that a mom has in a certain area, and the same thing for the young girls, that, you know, this is what a mom does, and this is what is important from the standpoint of that union, which we call marriage.
Now, I absolutely 100% agree with him. If you're going to have instruction about these matters of sexuality and the family, then at least let's have it be consistent with the Bible. Otherwise, tell the public schools to just stay out of it altogether. Focal Point AFR Talk.